Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with another video lecture for History 2111. We've talked about Spanish colonization, we've talked about how the French got into the colonization business with their colony of New France, and today we're going to discuss the beginnings of English colonization on the Atlantic coast in the New World with the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. Um, so the British attitude was similar to that of the French. The Spanish officially owned all of North America, but it became clear they had no intention of colonizing all of North America. And so the English felt that it would be in their best national interest to step in and seize a piece of that action. And in the 1580s, an English knight named Sir Walter Raleigh went to his sovereign, Queen Elizabeth I, with a proposal. He wanted to create a colony in America to serve as a base for English ships from which they could launch attacks on the Spanish treasure ships carrying back silver and gold from New Spain. And Elizabeth thought that was a very good idea, and so she gave Raleigh permission to establish the first Virginia colony. Raleigh named the colony Virginia in honor of Elizabeth. Well, you may ask the question, why? Why, if her name was Elizabeth, how was Virginia paying homage to her? Well, Queen Elizabeth never married, and she never had any children throughout her long reign from 1558 to 1603. And as a result, the English people believed that she was always a virgin, and they called her the Virgin Queen. And so when Raleigh called his colony Virginia, he was paying tribute to Elizabeth I under that nickname of the Virgin Queen. So this first Virginia colony was located on Roanoke Island. Actually, it was off the coast of present-day North Carolina, not Virginia. And it started in 1585. But by 1587, the colony had disappeared. And to this day, no one really knows what became of the colony of Roanoke, whether it was wiped out by Indian attack, whether perhaps the settlers simply merged with the local Indians. It's one of the great mysteries of American history. What happened to this lost colony of Roanoke that just vanished? And scholars are still trying to figure that out. So the first attempt to start a Virginia colony in the New World was not successful. But then, after Queen Elizabeth died, a new king came to the throne, King James the First, and James was very interested in establishing colonies in the New World. So in 1606, he signed off on the charter of the Virginia Company, which was a new business corporation that was tasked with establishing a Virginia colony in the New World. And this was a very interesting feature of English colonization. When the Spanish and the French established colonies, it was the government that was in charge of those efforts, and they sent soldiers and so forth to make that happen. But in the English colonies, a lot of times the government outsourced, if you will, the colonizing effort to business corporations. And this is what happened in Virginia, and as we'll see, it also happened in the Massachusetts Bay colony. And that gave English colonization a somewhat different atmosphere, you could say, or a different approach than Spanish or French colonization. In a lot of ways, the English government was not as involved with their colonies, at least at first, as Spain and France were. And so the colonists, in a way, got used to having more independence. Now, these companies could tighten the screws sometimes, and they could have very strict rules of their own. But the colonists, in many ways, were not supervised very closely by the English government. And I personally think that that helped to create habits of independence in the colonies of England that would feed into the later event called the American Revolution, which we'll learn about later in the course. Well, in May 1607, the Virginia Company sent over the first settlers who sailed up the James River in present-day Virginia this time and established the town of Jamestown, which would become the capital of the Virginia colony, named after King James, of course. And this did become the first permanent English colony in the New World, Virginia, with its capital at Jamestown. This is a map, an English map of early Virginia. You see there the Chesapeake Bay, and you see the three great rivers of Virginia branching off from it, the York, the James, and the Rappahannock. But you also see that the English were very much aware from the beginning that they were not the only people in Virginia. If you look at the top left corner and also over on the right margin, you see depictions of Native Americans, Indians. And the story of these Virginia natives is a very interesting one. There had been many powerful tribes in this region, but they had already come into contact with the Spanish missionaries, who, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, had established missions up and down the Atlantic coast. And as a result, they had been exposed to the post-contact diseases that the Spanish brought over with them. And so the population of Indians in this region had really collapsed, and many of the tribes had nearly disappeared. However, a great leader emerged in the region, a chief named Powhatan. You see, that's his picture up at the top left, Powhatan, who organized all of the surviving Indian groups into a new confederacy, which became known as the Powhatan Confederacy. And so Powhatan helped the Indians in Virginia to reorganize after being attacked by the post-contact diseases, and he became a very powerful ruler of this new and powerful tribe, the Powhatan Confederacy, and certainly a force that the English settlers had to deal with. In fact, a lot of the early history of Virginia has to do with the relationship between the English settlers and the Indians. At first, the English settlers tried to make friends with the Indians. That was the policy set forth in the charter of the Virginia Company, and it was also the policy of the first president of Virginia, whose name was Edward Maria Wingfield. But there were other settlers in the colony who really wanted to adopt a new policy with the Indians, and the leader of this group was Captain John Smith. He was a very interesting character. Captain John Smith was what we call a mercenary, a soldier of fortune. That is, he had been a soldier for hire for a number of years in various wars on the continent of Europe, and then he came to Virginia. And Smith accused President Wingfield of being too friendly, too buddy-buddy with the local Indians. He wanted to get tough with the local Indians, use the advanced English weapons to show them who was boss and so forth. And so, in September 1608, Smith actually led a coup against Wingfield. That is, he overthrew Wingfield as the president of Virginia and established himself as the new president. And as president of the Virginia colony, Smith did take a new, more aggressive approach to Indian relations. So often the colonists, if they were hungry and needed food, they would simply surround an Indian village and threaten them with their guns if they did not hand over corn or other foodstuff to the English settlers. In other ways, however, we could say that Smith really did improve the colony. One of the main problems in Virginia at the outset was that most of the initial settlers were actually from wealthy families. They were younger sons of wealthy families. In England, usually the entire estate would go to the eldest son when the father died. And that meant that the younger sons, if there were any, would have to find some other way to make their fortune in the world. And so some of these younger sons of these wealthy families wound up in Virginia. And these guys had never done a lick of work in their life. They had always had servants to do the work for them. And furthermore, they were not interested in farming. They didn't really know how to farm. What they were interested in was finding gold. You know, after all, the Spanish had gotten rich off their colonies, digging up gold and silver. So these English settlers felt like easy riches had to be there if they could only find where the gold and silver was. And so instead of farming and building houses and trying to survive, the settlement at first focused on trying to find gold and exploring the region in search of gold. And as a result, many of the settlers were starving. There were cases where people even killed other settlers to get their food supplies and so forth, and it was a real crisis. Excuse me. And so Smith, in his letters back to the Virginia Company, urged them, if they were going to send over more settlers, to please not send any more of these aristocrats, no more of these rich kids. Instead, he wanted them to send ordinary working folks who knew how to farm, who knew how to survive, so that they could work hard and plant crops and get the colony on a more secure footing. And so Smith's policy in this regard really did help the colony to survive. Not everyone in Virginia liked Smith, however. One of the aristocratic settlers from a wealthy family named George Percy at one point said Smith was a, quote, ambitious, unworthy, and vainglorious fellow, end quote. In other words, he was very proud, very conceited, very cocky, and didn't like him. And there was an incident in 1609 which was very, very suspicious. One day Smith was standing next to a big keg of gunpowder, which somehow mysteriously exploded. And Smith was badly injured and badly burned, and he had to actually go back to England and quit his job as president of the colony so that he could go back to England and recuperate. Well, a lot of historians believe this was not an accident, that this was actually an assassination attempt designed to get Smith out of the way. That was put together by people who didn't like Smith, and you know, that does seem to be a very likely possibility. So in any case, Smith was no longer the president of the colony, but in his short tenure he had set the tone that many future governors would follow with this get tough Indian policy and the policy of requiring the settlers to work for a living. But now we come to the very interesting story of Pocahontas. And, you know, there have been many, many movies and books about Pocahontas. Many of you have probably seen the Disney Pocahontas movie. I have to say, I hate to disappoint anyone, but I have to say that Pocahontas did not actually have a romantic relationship with Captain John Smith. That is a fiction. Smith never even claimed such a thing. That's Hollywood. That's Disney, you know. But Pocahontas did lead a really fascinating life. So what do we know about the real Pocahontas? Well, we know that she was born in the year 1595. She was the daughter of Powhatan, the great chief of the Virginia Indians. And in fact, she was his favorite daughter. She was really daddy's girl, you know, and he loved her so much he would do anything for her. She really had him twisted around her little finger. He called her Matoaka, which means the playful one. So apparently she had a very lively and vibrant personality that really captivated Powhatan, um, and made her his favorite. And that really plays into the most famous story about Pocahontas, which is in all the movies. Um, John Smith, in one of his books, related this tale that in 1607 he had been captured by the Powhatan Indians, and they were getting ready to execute him. So there were some warriors standing over him with clubs in their hands, just waiting the order from Powhatan to beat John Smith's brains out, when suddenly Pocahontas appeared, threw herself on John Smith's body, and begged her father to spare Smith's life, which he did. And so, historians have debated whether this famous story really happened or not. It's a little suspicious. Smith only wrote about this about 20 years after it supposedly happened. And some historians think it was a complete fabrication. However, in recent years, there's been a new line of argument that probably what was going on, this was a ritual. It was kind of an adoption ceremony, because when Indian tribes would adopt people into their tribe, sometimes they would stage this kind of near-death experience and before adopting them. And so I think this is probably the most likely explanation, that Powhatan was staging this adoption ritual. He wanted to adopt Smith into the tribe, and the near-death experience was part of that. So, in any case, the next news we get of Pocahontas in 1613, we know that she was in fact kidnapped by the English settlers, and she was put on a boat in the James River and held as a hostage, not for ransom money, but she was held as a hostage to guarantee that Powhatan would not attack the English settlers. You see, the English knew that she was his favorite daughter, and that if he attacked while they had her in custody, they could just kill her, and Powhatan would never risk that. And so she was held as a hostage for Powhatan's good behavior. But while she was there, being held in custody by the English, apparently she became interested in Christianity and was converted to the Christian religion and was baptized and given the baptismal name Rebecca. And then she fell in love with one of the English settlers, John Rolfe, and John Rolfe fell in love with her. Now, Rolfe, we know from his writings that he hesitated at first to marry Pocahontas because, unlike with the Spanish and French, in English culture there was a real taboo against interracial marriage. I mean, the English did not normally marry Native Americans, okay? Even though that was very common in New Spain and New France, the English just didn't do it. There was a prejudice against that in their culture. But John Rolfe overcame that prejudice, and one of the reasons that he did agree to marry Pocahontas was that he knew that this could serve as an important symbol that might help to make peace between the English and the Indians. This marriage between an English man and an Indian woman might help to establish more friendly relations between the settlers and the Indians. And in fact, that was true. As long as Pocahontas lived, her marriage to John Rolfe really did help to keep the peace between the Indians and the settlers. So they did marry in 1614, and then the following year, Pocahontas gave birth to a son, Thomas Rolfe, who did live into adulthood and had descendants. And so actually there are quite a few people today descended from Pocahontas. Well, news of this marriage had gotten back to London and the Virginia Company, and the company decided to mount a kind of PR campaign using the Rolfes as the centerpiece. And so they brought John Rolfe and Pocahontas, Rebecca Rolfe, to to England to tour around and to, um, in a way, advertise the colony, try to attract more settlers, and so forth. And this journey was a great, great success. I mean, as soon as they got to England, Pocahontas really became a big celebrity in England. People made pictures with her image on it, like the one on the left there that you see. Um, and you could buy souvenirs, mugs and things with her image on them. And the inscription on this image is very interesting. If you look at the very bottom, it says, Matuaka alias Rebecca, daughter to the mighty Prince Powhatan, Emperor. So you see there was a lot of respect for the fact that she was the daughter of a powerful chief, or emperor as the English called him. She was considered to be a princess of royal blood, and in fact she was presented to King James and Queen Anne at court, and she was treated like royalty. And so this trip was a complete triumph in every respect. However, unfortunately, when Pocahontas and her husband got onto the boat at Gravesend in England to sail back to Virginia, Pocahontas became ill with some disease. We don't know what it was, possibly typhoid fever. But in any case, before the ship sailed, she died on board the ship and was actually buried there in England, never made it back to Virginia. And so that was the end of Pocahontas' life, but you can say that for someone who had such a short life, it was very, very eventful. And I think, the deep significance of Pocahontas' life, again, comes in that idea of her as a peacemaker, as a symbol of peace and harmony between the English and the Indians. Unfortunately, that peace and harmony would not last very long after the death of Pocahontas, as we'll see. So Pocahontas' husband, John Rolfe, was now a widower, but he continued to be very important in the colony. It was John Rolfe who actually helped Virginia to find its new cash crop, tobacco, because since he was married to Pocahontas and he had connections with the Indians, he was able to get different kinds of tobacco plants, which he then experimented with to try to figure out which would bear the biggest crop, which tasted best when you smoked them, and so forth. And so it was Rolfe who really got the colonists involved in the planting of tobacco, which became their big cash crop. And actually, many of the English had already become hooked on tobacco that had come from Spain. That was partly, believe it or not, because doctors in those days believed that tobacco was actually good for you. And especially good if you had lung ailments like asthma. So believe it or not, doctors in Europe would actually prescribe tobacco for their patients who had asthma, thinking that it would help them to get better. And so it really caught on, and many Europeans became hooked and addicted on tobacco. There was only one prominent Englishman who really hated tobacco, and that happened to be the king, King James I, who in 1611 came out with a book called A Counterblast to Tobacco, in which he said that tobacco was, quote, loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs, end quote. So you could say that King James was actually the first anti-smoking activist. He was very much ahead of his time in that respect. But King James also knew that the Virginia colony did need a cash crop to finance its operations and to keep itself going. And so he didn't actually forbid the Virginians to grow tobacco. He allowed them to raise it and to export it back to England, but he did impose a very large tax on tobacco to try to prevent, in a sense, to discourage people from smoking. And that tradition has endured down to the present day. Tobacco, along with alcohol, are one of the among the most heavily taxed items we have, as governments try to make money and also discourage people from indulging in those items. Um, Now, tobacco did save the colony in a way, brought it a great source of income, but um, the particular requirements of growing tobacco really would help establish the tone for Virginia for many years to come, and would have a huge influence on the history of the South and the history of the nation as a whole as it emerged. And I know a lot about this actually because my grandparents were tobacco farmers in western Kentucky, and my mom, who is 82 years old, still doesn't like to talk about what it was like growing up as a farm girl on a tobacco farm, because tobacco is a very difficult crop to grow. It's very labor intensive. It's really a year-round thing. So it starts in the very early spring. You grow these little seedlings, tobacco plants, and then you transplant them out into the fields. You have to make sure that the tobacco plants grow properly up these tobacco sticks. All right. And then, this was the part my mom really hated. There are these big green tobacco worms, which at that time and in my mom's day you had to pick off by hand. Okay, and she remembers as a little girl going out in the fields and picking these big green worms off the tobacco plants, which she hated. Nowadays, I think pesticides take care of that, but in any case, it required a lot of cultivation, a lot of work, and then when the harvest came, there was still more work to do, because then after you harvest the crop, you have to put it into a tobacco barn and build these slow fires underneath it to cure the tobacco, and this goes on for several weeks. And so it's a very labor-intensive crop, very hard work. It also exhausts the soil very quickly. So a lot of times tobacco farmers would farm a few years in one place and then they'd have to move and break up a new farm in another place, which was a lot of work. And so what all this meant was that in colonial Virginia there was a huge demand for labor. And at first the Virginia Company believed that they could meet this demand by bringing over white English or Scottish people as indentured servants. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it became apparent over time that they could not get enough laborers that way. And so that's why Virginia turned to African American slavery as the solution to their labor problem, which obviously had a huge impact in developing the slave system as it emerged in the South, and that will be an ongoing theme for this lecture and for this course. Yes, need for labor. We already talked about that. Okay. Back to Indian relations. So after Powhatan died, the new chief was his brother, who had a really kind of jaw-breaking, tongue-twisting name, Opechancanough. Opechancanough. Opechancanough really was very suspicious of the English settlers. He didn't trust them. He saw that more and more settlers were coming over, wanting more and more land. And Opechancanough believed that it was necessary for the Indians to rise up and nip this colony in the bud to prevent it from taking over all of the Indians' land. And so in 1622, Opechancanough came up with a super secret plan to wipe out all of the English settlers in one stroke. And the plan was that the Indians would approach the houses of the local settlers one morning, pretending to be traders, wanting to trade for food or so forth. And when the English settlers let them into their homes, they would grab the settlers' weapons and kill them. And so this plan was executed, And it almost succeeded. Actually, about a third of the settlers were wiped out.